It was a hot, sticky afternoon in the summer of 2002 when a logger named Travis Elmore was deep in the woods outside a small town in Mississippi. He'd been clearing land for a new access road, something he'd done hundreds of times before. The forest was quiet, except for the steady hum of his chainsaw and the occasional cry of a crow overhead. But when he went to remove an old tree stump that had rotted through the middle, he found something strange wedged between the thick roots, something that didn't belong there. It wasn't just old wood or rusted metal. It was something that made him step back, his hands trembling. And it would soon unravel a mystery that had haunted the town for over 2 decades. The town was called Lucille, a place most folks would pass right by without ever knowing it existed. Quiet, rural, and mostly forgotten, Lucille had the kind of slow, steady pace where everyone knew your name and your business. But back in 1977, this sleepy southern town was shaken by the unexplained disappearance of a beloved figure in the community, Pastor Elijah Gaines. A tall, kind-eyed man in his early 40s, Pastor Gaines was more than just a preacher. He was a mentor, a father figure, a man who spent his days visiting the sick, organizing food drives, and preaching unity in a time when racial tension still lingered thick in the air. He led the congregation of the New Light Missionary Baptist Church, a modest white wooden chapel that sat at the edge of town, its bell tower rising just above the tree line. On the morning of August 14, 1977, Pastor Gaines left his home just before sunrise. He told his wife, Loretta, that he was heading to the church early to prepare for Sunday's sermon. She remembers him giving her a soft kiss on the cheek and telling her he'd be home by noon. But he never came back. His car, an old Chevrolet Impala, was later found parked neatly behind the church, keys still in the ignition. The doors were locked. Nothing inside looked out of place. But Pastor Gaines was gone. The town panicked. Search teams formed within hours. People combed the woods, the nearby river, even abandoned houses. The police got involved, though some residents felt the effort lacked urgency. Rumors started to spread. Some said he ran off with a woman. Others whispered darker theories, that someone in town didn't like the way he was speaking out about injustice, or that he'd stumbled on something he wasn't supposed to see. But as the weeks turned into months, and then years, hope slowly faded. Loretta, heartbroken and alone, kept his photo on the mantel and never changed the locks on their door. "He'll walk back through one day," she'd say. "I know he will." But by the time 25 years had passed, most people had stopped talking about Elijah Gaines. Life moved on, as it always does. Kids who grew up hearing his name had children of their own. The church still stood, though it had long since welcomed a new pastor. And the mystery of that August morning became more like a ghost story, a piece of local lore that old-timers would share at family reunions and barbershops. That is, until Travis made that discovery in the woods. He didn't know who to call at first. What he found under the tree stump didn't make much sense, at least not until the sheriff's office arrived and began piecing it together. Hidden beneath the thick roots were fragments of cloth, a rusted ring, and something wrapped in an old, decaying leather-bound Bible. There was no grave marker, no sign that anyone had intentionally buried what they found. It looked more like the forest had swallowed it up over time. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just any lost item. What Travis had uncovered would blow open a cold case that had sat untouched for decades. Word spread quickly. Reporters came. Former residents returned, hoping for answers. Loretta Gaines, now in her 70s, was brought in to identify what little was found. She clutched the worn Bible in her hands and wept. Inside the back cover, written in faded ink, were the words, "If you find this, tell my wife I never stopped loving her." The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Elijah's. The discovery set off a whirlwind of questions. How did these items end up under that tree? Was it possible that Pastor Gaines had been there all along? Had he been taken? Had someone hidden him away, only to let nature cover up the truth? Or was this just another cruel twist in a story that had already left so many broken? Investigators reopened the case, but many of those involved back in 1977 were either retired or gone. Records had been lost, memories faded, and the few witnesses who remained were reluctant to talk. Some claimed they had seen a strange car near the church that morning. Others remembered odd noises in the woods around the time of his disappearance. But none of it added up. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, Nothing that could definitively point to what had really happened to Pastor Elijah Gaines. Yet one thing became clear: this wasn't just a story about a man who vanished. It was about a community forced to face its past, about the secrets that can live just beneath the surface of even the most peaceful towns. It was about how one act, one moment of truth, can ripple across generations. And still, despite the new evidence, no one knew exactly what happened in those final hours before Pastor Gaines disappeared. Was it betrayal by someone he trusted? A random act of violence? Or something more calculated, buried deeper than anyone had imagined? As more clues began to surface and old voices began to speak up, the truth seemed within reach. But just when the investigation appeared to be turning a corner, something happened that shocked even the most seasoned detectives and left the town of Lucille more shaken than ever. Because just a few weeks after Travis's discovery, a second stump was removed. And what they found next changed everything. The second stump was about 30 yards from where the first had been, just far enough to raise eyebrows, but close enough to make it feel connected. Travis hadn't planned to remove it that day. In fact, he'd marked it to be skipped because of how deep the roots seemed to go. But something pulled at him. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe instinct. He didn't know. What he did know was that the moment his saw touched the base of that old, gnarled pine, the air around him seemed to shift. He'd later tell his wife it felt like the woods were holding their breath. When the roots finally cracked apart, what was inside wasn't a Bible this time, or a piece of cloth. It was a rusted tin box, sealed shut with wire and wrapped in plastic that had nearly disintegrated. Travis opened it carefully, half expecting it to be full of old nails or animal bones. But instead, inside were several yellowed pages of what looked like journal entries and a photograph. The photo was faded and bent at the corners, but clear enough to make out the faces. It showed Pastor Elijah Gaines standing beside a man no one in town could name. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark suit with a wide brim hat that shaded his eyes. He didn't look like he belonged there, not in Lucille, not in that time. And there was something in his expression, something off. Even though the picture was old, you could feel it. Tension, unease. Elijah, on the other hand, looked nervous, like he didn't want to be in the photo at all. The pages were harder to make sense of. They were handwritten, some smudged by water or time, but a few lines stood out. One read, "He said if I keep asking questions, I'll end up like them." Another, "I'm scared for Loretta. I think he's watching the house." There was no name given, no direct accusation, but every sentence dripped with fear, as if Elijah had known something was coming and had no one he could trust enough to stop it. Sheriff Dalton Harris, the man now overseeing the case, was just a rookie deputy when Pastor Gaines disappeared. He remembered the search vividly. He remembered the church gatherings, the prayer circles, the whispered rumors that came late at night. Now, seeing this new evidence laid out on the table in front of them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd missed something all those years ago. Something big. He took the photo and journal pages to Loretta first. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but she had waited the longest. When she saw the picture, her hand flew to her mouth. "That's him," she said, barely above a whisper. "That's the man who came by the house a week before Elijah disappeared." Her eyes were full of tears, not from shock, but from recognition. "Elijah never told me his name. Just said he was someone from Jackson, someone with connections." "Connections to what?" Dalton asked. She hesitated. "To people who didn't want him digging into that land deal." Dalton blinked. "What land deal?" Loretta looked down. A few months before he vanished, Elijah was talking to some of the older families about property on the north end of town, where the old mill used to be. He thought something wasn't right. The deeds didn't match. A few names had been forged. He thought people were being pushed off their land quietly, under the table. It was the first real lead they'd ever had, and it pointed to something far more complex than a simple disappearance. Elijah Gaines might not have been a random victim. He might have been silenced. The town's history had always been murky. Old records weren't well kept, especially when it came to property owned by black families in the early 20th century. Stories of land being taken without notice, of papers signed under pressure or without consent, were not uncommon. But no one had ever challenged it until Pastor Gaines. As the investigation deepened, Dalton brought in an archivist from Jackson to go through property records, church documents, and whatever was left from that era. One name kept coming up: Thomas Bellamy. A wealthy businessman with deep roots in Lucille, Bellamy had owned much of the land surrounding the church in the 70s, including the area where the second tree stump had been found. Bellamy was long dead by then, but his name still carried weight. His grandson, Richard Bellamy, ran several businesses in town and sat on the city council. He was polished, well-spoken, and deeply respected. When asked about his grandfather's dealings, Richard said all he knew was that Thomas had bought up and used land to help build new housing and shops. If there were issues with the paperwork, he said, I've never seen them. But others weren't so sure. An older woman named Mildred Hart, who had lived on the edge of town for over 80 years, told reporters that she remembered Elijah coming to her door once, asking about her late husband's property. He had maps, photocopies, and questions, she said. Said someone had signed a sale contract after my husband died. Told me I might still own part of it. That same land was now part of a large commercial lot, owned by, you guessed it, the Bellamy estate. As more people came forward, a pattern began to form. Names, signatures, and dates that didn't match. A trail of quiet pressure. And in the center of it all, a preacher who had been trying to do the right thing, even if it meant standing alone. Still, none of it explained how his Bible and ring ended up buried beneath a tree, or who the man in the photograph really was, or why, if Elijah had known he was in danger, he hadn't told more people. Then came the strange phone call. It happened late one night at the sheriff's office. A voice, low, raspy, almost like it had been injured, said only this: he didn't run. He was taken. And not everyone who helped is dead. Then the line went dead. The call couldn't be traced. It lasted only 16 seconds, but it sent a chill through everyone involved. Someone was still watching. Someone who remembered. And someone who didn't want the truth to come out. The next day, Dalton found his office door cracked open. Nothing was missing, but the box containing the photograph and journal pages had been moved, just slightly. Enough for him to know someone had been there. No fingerprints. No camera footage. Just a silent warning. The deeper they looked, the more it became clear Pastor Elijah Gaines hadn't just vanished. He had been caught in something much bigger than anyone had realized. And the people who wanted him gone had done a good job of erasing the evidence. Almost. But with each piece uncovered, from the roots of trees to the roots of secrets buried in town history, the truth was getting harder to keep hidden. The town of Lucille, once content with silence, was now whispering again. And in those whispers, a storm was building. Because just when they thought they'd seen everything, a third stump was found. And this time, what they uncovered wasn't a photograph. It was a name that no one had dared speak in over 20 years. And that name would change everything. The third stump was uncovered almost by accident. The logging team had moved farther up the ridge, working through thick brush where the land hadn't been touched in decades. It was early morning, with mist still clinging low across the ground, and most of the crew was still groggy from the long drive out. One of the workers, a young guy named Mateo, spotted the base of the stump near a patch of blackberry thorns. It looked like the others, old, hollowed, and half-rotted, but when he kicked at it to check for snakes, he heard a hollow thud beneath his boot. Not the sound of dirt. The sound of something wooden and flat. They dug slowly this time. After the last two discoveries, they didn't want to disturb anything. About 2 feet below the surface, buried under a layer of compacted roots and dry leaves, they found a box. Not a tin one like before. This was a handmade wooden crate, weathered and nearly falling apart at the seams. Inside was a single envelope wrapped in cloth, and written across it, in neat handwriting, was a name: Harold Red Benton. That name hadn't been spoken in Lucille in over 20 years. Not since he left town in the middle of the night, without warning, just a few weeks after Pastor Elijah Gaines disappeared. Red Benton was once known as the town troublemaker. Tall, red-haired, and always in some sort of mess, he'd been in and out of jail since he was a teenager, mostly for petty theft and bar fights. But people also remembered him for something else. He was one of the few white men in Lucille who had started attending New Light Missionary Baptist Church shortly before Elijah vanished. Some folks found that strange. Others thought maybe he was trying to turn his life around. But no one really knew why he was there, or what conversations he might have had with the pastor. The sheriff opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded letter, creased and yellowed with time. The writing was shaky, but the message was clear. Red had witnessed something he shouldn't have. The night before Elijah disappeared, Red claimed he saw him arguing in the woods with two men, one of them wearing a wide-brim hat, the same man from the photo found in the second stump. Red didn't name the second man, but he hinted that he was someone important in Lucille, someone who didn't like being questioned. Red wrote that he had planned to come forward. He even went to the police, but when he got there, someone was already waiting for him in the parking lot. No badge, just a warning. Leave it alone. That night, Red packed up his truck and vanished. Now, with this letter resurfacing, the puzzle began to feel more complete, but also more dangerous. Sheriff Dalton tried to track Red down, but there was no trace. No license renewals. No property. Not even a paper trail. It was like he'd disappeared off the map completely. Back in town, tensions were starting to rise. People who'd lived quietly for years were now whispering again. Old families who'd once run the town behind closed doors didn't like that the past was being stirred up. Even members of the church, including Pastor Elijah's former deacon, Amos Jenkins, were growing nervous. Amos was in his 80s now, mostly homebound, but when Dalton visited him with the photo and letter, the old man grew quiet. He didn't deny recognizing the man in the hat. We all knew who he was, Amos said, but no one dared say his name. He didn't need to raise his voice. Just a look from him could shut a room down. When asked if that man might still have connections in Lucille, Amos gave a small, sad smile. Boys like him don't leave, they just change clothes. Meanwhile, Loretta Gaines was struggling. The discovery of the journal pages and now the letter had reopened wounds she thought had finally started to scab over. She sat most evenings in her front room, staring out the window like she used to back in 1977, waiting for Elijah to walk back up the path. Her granddaughter, Simone, had moved in to care for her and had started her own digging, looking through old church ledgers and newspaper clippings. Simone found something strange. In the weeks before Elijah disappeared, the church's financial records showed a sudden spike in donations, large sums from anonymous sources. It didn't make sense. The congregation wasn't wealthy. Where was the money coming from? And why? She brought the records to Dalton, who sent them for handwriting analysis. One of the donation slips bore a signature that partially matched a name from an old land deed tied to the Bellamy estate. The connections were getting tighter and more dangerous. The sheriff began receiving anonymous tips, some helpful, some cryptic. One note was taped to the windshield of his cruiser one night. Keep pushing, and you'll end up where he did. Another was mailed directly to his home. No return address. Ask Richard Bellamy about the lodge. No one had mentioned a lodge before. But after digging through old town records, Dalton discovered that Thomas Bellamy had once owned a private hunting cabin in the woods, just beyond the town's edge. The property had been sold quietly in the early 1980s, right after the investigation into Elijah's disappearance went cold. The new owner? A shell company connected to a law firm in Jackson. Dalton organized a quiet search, bringing only one deputy he trusted. The cabin was still there, boarded up, overgrown, and nearly swallowed by the trees. Inside, it smelled of mildew and old wood. But tucked behind a loose panel in the wall, they found a small tin lockbox. It held a stained notebook, a broken rosary, and a pocket watch with the initials E.G. Dalton held the watch in his hand for a long time, feeling the weight of it. Another piece of Elijah's life. Another silent witness to something long buried. But still, no clear answers. As word of the discovery spread, the people of Lucille became divided. Some wanted justice. Others just wanted peace. A few older residents began locking their doors for the first time in years. They remembered what it was like when things were stirred up, and they feared where all this was leading. Meanwhile, Richard Bellamy remained calm, smiling politely whenever reporters asked him questions. My family has always worked hard to build this community, he'd say. These rumors are just that, rumors. But behind closed doors, he had started meeting with lawyers, preparing for something. Preparing for what? No one knew. And all the while, more questions bubbled to the surface. Why did Elijah go to the church early that morning? What exactly did he uncover in those deeds? And if Red Benton was telling the truth, who was the second man in the woods that night? One thing was certain, the past was no longer staying buried. And something else was coming. Something darker than anyone expected. The days after the cabin discovery passed like a slow burn. Sheriff Dalton barely slept. The pocket watch with Elijah's initials never left his desk, and the notebook found alongside it, mostly blank except for a few scribbled lines, kept circling his mind. One phrase, in particular, was repeated more than once. The deal was never meant to be clean. It didn't say who wrote it, and the handwriting didn't match Elijah's or Red Benton's. It felt like a warning left behind by someone too scared to say more. Simone, Loretta's granddaughter, had been digging deeper into the donations and found something even stranger. One of the anonymous checks had been routed through a bank in Birmingham under the name East Pine Holdings. On a hunch, she cross-referenced the name with land ownership records. Sure enough, East Pine Holdings had purchased the parcel of land where the first Stump and Elijah's Bible had been found. That land was registered in 1977, just 2 weeks after Pastor Gaines disappeared. But the more they uncovered, the more pressure they began to feel. Dalton noticed a black SUV parked across from the sheriff's office 2 nights in a row. It never stayed long, just enough to be noticed. His phone started getting interference, calls dropping, static cutting through radio signals. At first, he thought he was being paranoid. But when his personal laptop disappeared from his home while he was out buying groceries, he knew it wasn't his imagination. They were being watched. Simone began receiving anonymous messages too. At first, it was just silent calls. Then a voicemail from a distorted voice. Stop asking questions. She tried to file a police report, but there was no number attached. She pressed on anyway, driven by something deeper than fear. This was no longer just about her grandfather. It was about every name erased, every family pushed off land that once belonged to them. Back at the church, Amos Jenkins had become restless. He started calling old members of the congregation, trying to piece together anything he'd forgotten. One call led him to a woman named Betty Lou Sanders, who had moved away years ago but returned to care for her sister. Betty Lou remembered something she'd buried for decades. The night Elijah vanished, she said, she saw a car she didn't recognize parked near the church. A dark sedan with state tags. 2 men stepped out, one with a limp and the other in a hat that shadowed his eyes. They stayed parked for nearly an hour. She never saw Elijah come out. When Dalton brought her into the station to give a statement, she was shaking. I was too scared to speak back then, she said. But I always knew something was wrong. He was scared those last few weeks, always looking over his shoulder. The investigation, quiet at first, was now boiling. Rumors spread fast. Everyone in town seemed to know something was going on, but no one knew how far it would reach. Simone was asked to stop attending public meetings. Dalton got pulled aside by the mayor, who suggested he let the past stay buried. But neither of them could stop now. The truth was closer than ever. Then came the break no one expected. A retired land surveyor named Walter Brinks came forward after seeing the news. He had kept maps, copies of old deeds, and field notes from his 30 years of work in Lucille. One map showed a marked boundary near the land behind New Light Church with a handwritten note, buried lines. Conflict with Bellamy claim. Gaines raised concerns. Walter remembered the meeting. He was angry, he told Dalton. Said the lines had been moved without community input. He was going to take it to the county if he had to. That same week, Walter was reassigned and told the case was closed. No explanation. He hadn't thought about it in years until now. Dalton took the map and compared it with current property lines. The difference was small, but significant, just enough to turn church land into commercial property. If Elijah had found out, it would have been enough to blow the whistle. And it made sense why someone would want to stop him. But the biggest shock came when a fingerprint analysis came back on the rusted tin box found under the second stump. The lab matched it to a known felon, James Dunley, a former security contractor who'd worked in Jackson during the 1970s. Dunley had connections to East Pine Holdings and, more importantly, had once worked as a fixer for property disputes involving high-value land transfers. Dunley was still alive, living in a gated community just outside Baton Rouge. Dalton didn't wait. He drove 6 hours with his deputy and a warrant. When they arrived, Dunley didn't look surprised. He was older now, frail and nearly blind in one eye, but his voice still held weight. "You're here about the preacher," he said flatly. Dalton nodded. Dunley leaned back in his chair. "I told them not to bury anything near those trees. Told in the roots, don't forget." Dalton froze. What happened that night? But Dunley just smiled, slow and thin. "I don't talk to uniforms." I talked to lawyers. The interview ended there. But the damage was done. Dunley's prints on the box. The property map showing altered lines. The donation checks. Red Benton's letter. It was all coming together. Yet no one dared move forward. Not publicly. Not without one final piece. And that piece came unexpectedly. Late one evening, Simone received a package delivered with no return address. Inside was a cassette tape and a typed note. I kept this because I knew one day someone would come asking again. She rushed it to Dalton. They had to dig out an old player from the evidence room just to hear it. The tape clicked. A voice came through, calm, certain. It was Elijah Gaines. I know they're coming for me, he said. But I'm not afraid. If anything happens, let it be known that I didn't back down. This land belongs to the people. And God doesn't look kindly on thieves, no matter how much money they have. There was a pause. Then the sound of footsteps. A second voice, cold and clear. You should have stayed quiet, Reverend. The tape ended in static. It was the missing piece. Proof that Elijah knew. Proof that someone else had silenced him. Dalton sat in his office long after the tape ended. The town was quiet outside. Too quiet. He knew the next step would change everything. Arrests. Trials. The truth on full display. But as he reached for the phone, the power went out. Every light in the building flickered, then died. Outside, the black SUV returned. Only this time, it didn't leave. Sheriff Dalton stood frozen in the darkness of his office, the soft hum of silence broken only by the creak of his chair as he shifted uneasily. The cassette tape still sat in front of him, its plastic casing cool under his fingertips. Outside, the black SUV was idling, its headlights off, hidden in the shadows just beyond the street lamp. Something about the timing was too perfect, too deliberate. The power outage, the tape, the SUV. This wasn't coincidence. This was a message. He quietly reached for his flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The generator hadn't kicked on, which meant either someone had tampered with it or they had cut the lines entirely. He radioed his deputy, but the signal was jammed. Just static. He felt his chest tighten, not out of fear, but out of an old instinct he hadn't felt in years. The feeling that someone, somewhere nearby, was watching. Meanwhile, Simone was at Loretta's house, still reeling from the tape. She hadn't played it for her grandmother yet. Something about the tone of Elijah's voice made her hesitate. It was brave, but it was also a goodbye. Loretta had held on to hope for 25 years, and Simone wasn't sure how to tell her that her grandfather had known exactly what was coming. She stepped outside to clear her head, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. That's when she saw them. Two men, walking slowly along the sidewalk across the street. One tall, one shorter, both wearing dark jackets. They weren't from Lucille. She would have recognized them. One of them stopped and looked directly at her. No smile. No nod. Just a long, silent stare. Then they turned the corner and vanished into the night. Back at the station, Dalton made it to the breaker room and found the wires sliced clean. No tools left behind. No prints. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. And they knew how to make a statement. By morning, the town was buzzing again. Word had spread about the tape, even though it hadn't been made public. Someone was leaking information. People began pulling their kids out of school early, locking their doors again like they did back in the late 70s when rumors first started about Elijah's disappearance. The tension in Lucille was thick enough to taste. But the biggest shock hadn't hit yet. A phone call came in just before noon from a small medical clinic 3 counties over. An elderly man had been brought in after a fall. He was muttering strange things in the ER. A nurse recognized one of the names he kept repeating, Elijah Gaines. The man's name was Harold Red Benton. Dalton didn't waste time. He drove out with 2 officers and found Red in a hospital bed, barely conscious, bruised but alert enough to speak. He'd been hiding for years, moving from state to state, never staying long. But his health had failed him, and with no insurance, no ID, and no money, he'd finally landed in a clinic that didn't ask questions. Dalton sat next to his bed and showed him the photo of the man in the wide brim hat. Red's eyes filled with tears. "That's him," he whispered. "He's the one who told me to keep my mouth shut. Said if I talked, my body would end up in the river like the preachers." Dalton's heart stopped. "Wait, river? You mean Elijah's body?" Red coughed hard, then nodded. "They didn't bury him under no tree. That was all to throw people off. They dumped him in the river near Hollow's Bend. weighted his legs with chain. I was there. I saw the chain in the truck bed. It was the second plot twist Dalton hadn't seen coming. All this time, everyone had been looking in the wrong place. The stumps, the woods, the church distractions. Red said the tree stumps were symbolic. A warning. Each one was planted like a marker. They wanted to scare people. Make them think Elijah was everywhere and nowhere. Dalton radioed in for a dive team. Hollow's Bend was about 30 minutes from Lucille, a slow-moving, winding stretch of river that was deep enough to hide anything for decades. They'd need sonar, divers, and backup. But as they left the hospital, another problem rose up. Back in town, the mayor had called an emergency council meeting behind closed doors. Word got back to Simone through a friend who worked at City Hall. The Bellamy family was trying to block the investigation, claiming irreparable harm to long-standing reputations and businesses. A lawyer from Jackson had been flown in that morning. And quietly, paperwork had been filed to seize all remaining evidence, citing chain of custody concerns. Simone rushed to the sheriff's office, only to find the front desk abandoned and the evidence room sealed. A man in a suit was standing inside with gloves, boxing everything: Elijah's journal, the cassette tape, the donation records. Simone pounded on the glass, shouting, but he didn't even flinch. Dalton returned to find her in tears. He burst into the back, only to be told he'd been placed on administrative leave pending review. The system was closing in. And fast. But that night, a voice message came through Dalton's personal line from a number he didn't recognize. It was short. Just 6 words. Check the river. You'll find him. No name. No clue who sent it. But the voice, it sounded familiar. The next morning, against orders, Dalton and Simone drove to Hollow's Bend. They brought no team, no press, just a flashlight, some rope, and an old map Red had drawn years ago. The river was silent. Mist hovered over it like breath. Dalton waded into the water near a bend in the trees, where Red claimed the truck had stopped. After about 20 minutes of searching, Simone spotted something caught between the rocks under the shallows. She screamed for Dalton. It was chain. Rusty, but unmistakable. As Dalton pulled it loose, he felt the metal give way and something heavy shift beneath the water. He turned to Simone, heart pounding. Call the state police. Tell them to bring everything. Simone nodded, eyes wide with fear and hope all tangled together. But as she reached for her phone, a shot rang out from the trees. Dalton dove, pulling her behind a boulder. A second shot hit the water near his leg. Someone didn't want them to find what was under that river. And they weren't going to stop now. The echo of gunfire still hung heavy in the air as Sheriff Dalton dragged Simone behind a moss-covered boulder. His heart was pounding so loud it nearly drowned out everything else. Simone's eyes were wide with panic, but her grip on the phone never loosened. She whispered that she had already dialed 911 before the first shot rang out. Somewhere on the other end, dispatch was listening. Dalton crouched low and peered toward the trees where the shot had come from. The forest was silent again. Too silent. He knew whoever pulled that trigger wasn't just trying to scare them. They were trying to make sure the truth stayed buried, just like Elijah. Slowly, he reached for the old service pistol he kept in his boot holster. He wasn't about to back down now. Not when they were so close. He signaled to Simone to stay put and crept forward, keeping his body low. He scanned the tree line. No movement. Just shadows and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then he saw it, a faint glint of metal catching the light. A scope, perched low against a tree trunk. But the shooter was gone. A sound behind him made him spin around, just a branch snapping underfoot, but enough to rattle his nerves. He turned back to Simone, who was crouched by the river's edge again, brushing away dirt from where the chain had been tangled. Something else was down there. It wasn't just debris or rusted metal. There was shape to it. Structure. Like a large, solid object partially buried beneath the riverbed. As distant sirens began to wail in the background, Dalton grabbed a long branch and prodded beneath the water. A hollow sound echoed back. Not stone. Not wood. Metal. It was a drum. No, a barrel. By the time the dive team arrived, Simone and Dalton had already cleared the surrounding area, marking it with red flags. The divers confirmed what Dalton suspected, a sealed 55-gallon drum, weighted with chains and wedged deep beneath layers of silt and debris. They hauled it to the riverbank slowly, and when the lid was pried open, a thick silence fell over the team. Inside were bones, clearly human, and a weather-worn cloth bearing what was once a white collar. Next to it, a broken gold cross. And below that, the unmistakable shape of a leather-bound journal. Though water-damaged, the initials remained, e.g. Sheriff Dalton stood in stunned silence. For over 2 decades, Elijah Gaines had been written off, whispered about, and erased. But now, there was no denying it. They had found him. The remains were rushed to forensics. The journal, still partially legible, was turned over to Simone and Dalton to analyze. What it revealed shifted everything. Elijah's final entries were heartbreaking. He had discovered that East Pine Holdings, under the guidance of a few powerful local men, including a Bellamy cousin, had forged deeds, falsified boundary surveys, and used intimidation to pressure black landowners into signing away family properties. When Elijah refused to help them convince the church elders to sign off on a land transfer, they turned on him. He wrote about threats, being followed, even a confrontation where someone had told him, "You're either with progress or in the way of it." He had planned to bring the evidence to the state attorney general, but he never got the chance. Within days of the discovery, media trucks lined the streets of Lucille. The town that had hidden its shame behind polite silence was suddenly the center of national attention. Sheriff Dalton stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by deputies and Simone, as he announced the identification of Elijah's remains and the opening of a criminal investigation into his murder and the land theft conspiracy. But just as things seemed to settle into the rhythm of justice, another twist came. Forensic analysis on the drum revealed fingerprints inside, ones that didn't belong to Elijah, nor to the known fixer, Dunley. Instead, they matched a DNA sample on record from a closed federal investigation involving corporate embezzlement in the early 2000s. The name attached sent a chill down Dalton's spine: Warren Bellamy. Warren wasn't just a relative of the Bellamy family. He had been the silent partner in East Pine Holdings from the start. He'd funneled money into the church through anonymous donations, paying off key people in exchange for silence or support. His involvement had never been documented publicly until now. But Warren had been presumed dead for over a decade, killed in a boating accident off the coast of Florida. So how could his fingerprints be in the barrel? Dalton turned to Simone, stunned. Unless he never died. She stared at him. You think he faked his death? It sounded absurd, but with the evidence mounting and timelines overlapping, it began to make sense. Someone with that much money, that much to lose, and the connections to disappear? It was possible. More than that, it was likely. Simone dug deeper into her grandfather's journal and discovered something chilling in the margins of one entry. Elijah had scribbled the name Warren B. next to a line that read, "The man behind the curtain always hides in the smoke." They began cross-referencing hospital records, real estate transfers, and shell company activity tied to East Pine. What they found shocked them even more. Just 3 years ago, a property had been purchased outside of Phoenix under a new LLC, founded the same year Warren Bellamy had died. The person who signed the paperwork used a fake name, but the handwriting matched old Bellamy documents perfectly. They took the findings to the FBI, who launched a formal investigation. Within days, a man living under the alias Martin Fields was taken into custody in Arizona. His prints matched. Warren Bellamy had been alive all along. The revelation rocked Lucille. A man presumed dead had been pulling strings from the shadows, protecting a lie that had silenced a town and stolen decades of truth from a grieving community. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about every family who had lost land. Every name crossed off quietly. Every envelope of hush money passed in the dark. Dalton stood on the bank of Hollows Bend once more, looking out over the water. Simone stood beside him, holding the journal, the edges worn now with use. She whispered, "He never stopped fighting, did he?" Dalton shook his head. "No. And because of that, neither can we." But just as they turned to leave, Simone's phone buzzed. A new email. No subject. No name. Just one sentence. "This isn't over." And below that, a video attachment. She pressed play. The screen flickered. It was grainy footage, time-stamped from 1977. A church hallway. Elijah walking quickly, looking over his shoulder. Behind him, 2 men followed. One wore a hat. The other, His face turned just enough toward the camera, looked eerily familiar. It was someone Simone had seen before. Someone still living in Lucille. And someone who had never once come forward. Simone's hands trembled as the grainy video played again. She squinted at the man's face, faded, shadowed by the poor lighting, but still recognizable. Her stomach dropped. She turned the screen toward Dalton without saying a word. He leaned in. "No," he muttered. "That's Deacon Martin." The name hit like a wave. Martin Chase, one of the longest-serving members of Mount Zion Baptist, a beloved figure in Lucille. He had led prayer circles, overseen fundraisers, and delivered eulogies for half the town. People trusted him, respected him, and somehow, through it all, he had managed to keep a secret that now threatened to destroy the image he'd built over decades. Dalton didn't waste time. He drove straight to Martin's home, Simone riding beside him in silence. The town was quiet that morning, a soft mist hanging over the streets. It felt like the calm after a storm, except the storm hadn't quite passed. Martin lived in a modest house just beyond the old mill, tucked behind overgrown hedges. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, he was already on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair like he had been expecting them. He didn't run, didn't deny anything. "I figured you'd come," he said softly, watching them approach. "Saw the news. Saw the river." Dalton didn't bother with small talk. "We saw the tape." Martin nodded slowly, then sighed. "I didn't kill Elijah, but I didn't stop it either. I was there when they took him. I was supposed to convince him to keep quiet. That's all. Just talk. But things got out of hand. They got scared. He had too much on them, too much truth." He looked down at his hands. "I stayed quiet because I thought it would protect the church, protect the community. But all it did was bury the truth with him." Dalton placed him under arrest, quietly and respectfully. No cuffs in front of the neighbors. No scene. Simone didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. The final days of the investigation moved quickly. Warren Bellamy was extradited back to Mississippi to stand trial, charged with conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder. Martin Chase agreed to testify, revealing the names of others involved and filling in the missing pieces of Elijah's final hours. With multiple corroborating witnesses and evidence from the recovered journal, the case against the former East Pine Holdings board members grew stronger by the day. Elijah's funeral was held again, this time properly. Thousands attended, not just from Lucille but from nearby towns, cities, and churches that had heard his story. His casket was laid in the same churchyard he once preached in, next to Loretta, who had passed only months before the case reopened. Though she never got to see this day, her faith in the truth had never wavered. Simone stood by the grave as the last hymn faded into the soft breeze. In her hand, she held Elijah's journal. Not the original, it had been preserved and archived, but a copy she kept close. His words lived on. His voice would never be silenced again. She had plans to open a local archive center for the town, collecting oral histories, documents, and records so no other story would be lost or buried. The community needed healing, and healing would only come through truth and remembrance. Dalton, too, found a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He remained sheriff, but with a new purpose. He pushed for reforms in town leadership, transparency in church and council finances, and a renewed effort to revisit other cold cases, ones that had gathered dust in backrooms for too long. The Bellamy estate was seized and divided among those whose land had been stolen. Families were given the chance to reclaim what was theirs. It didn't erase the past, but it brought a sense of justice long overdue. In the weeks that followed, Lucille began to change. The town still had its quiet streets and church bells on Sundays, but there was a new air of honesty. The silence that had once stifled conversations was replaced by open dialogue, community meetings, and shared memories. People spoke Elijah's name with reverence, not fear. One evening, Simone sat on the porch with Dalton, the sun setting in streaks of gold and orange over the town. She asked him something that had been on her mind for weeks. "Do you think all the truth came out?" "Everything." Dalton took a long breath and looked out at the horizon. "Maybe not everything, but enough to set things right. And if there's more, someone like you will find it." She smiled at that, but her eyes were still thoughtful. "It's strange, all this time. I thought Elijah's story ended in 1977. But I think maybe that was just the beginning." Dalton nodded. "It was. And because of him, this town has a second chance. As the sky darkened and the cicadas began their slow evening song, the story of Elijah Gaines, the black pastor who vanished, the man who stood for truth when it was dangerous, finally had its ending. Not the one his enemies planned, but the one his life deserved. His voice, once silenced, now echoed louder than ever in the hearts of those who chose to remember. And for the first time in 25 years, Lucille felt like it could breathe again.